The views and opinions expressed in this podcast by the host and or the guest do not necessarily reflect the views of the host and or Paranormal Buzz Radio and or its sponsors. Use of any material produced by Paranormal Buzz Radio without express written consent is prohibited. Paranormal Buzz Radio will not be held responsible for you holding your knees, crying, and rocking in a corner in a puddle of your own urine, or being beheaded by a group of children in a cornfield. In fact, if you come across a group of children in a cornfield, we promise to make fun of you as you run away screaming in terror. Listener discretion is advised.
Caution. You are now entering the all-consuming realm of Shay's Paranormal Chat, where the things that are better left unsaid are actually said.
Shut up and sit down.
You're listening to Shay's Paranormal Chat. Paranormal podcasting done Shay's way. Tons of fun.
Dude, seriously?
A bit sarcastic.
Hashtag investigator, not hunter.
But always real.
Hashtag data, not evidence.
Don't get your panties in a twist.
Oh my god, really?
This is real, raw conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show.
All right, everybody, welcome to another night of Shay's Paranormal Chat. Shay isn't able to be in tonight. She is not feeling well. So you guys are going to be stuck with myself, Allison, for those of you who don't know me, and Kim is here as well. So we're going to be filling in tonight. We do have a special guest for you tonight. We do have AP Sylvia, who's going to be discussing his book, Vampires of Lore and Traits of Modern Misconceptions. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Not a problem. Does it sound like it's echoing?
Mm-hmm. Sounds okay to me.
Okay.
He doesn't, but you do.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm echoing, but all right. Get that. We'll see if it... All right, so why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of background on yourself to start off with?
Sure thing. So I, as it was mentioned, I wrote a book about vampires. I've sort of had an interest in sort of legends and supernatural things for a long time. I was actually going through some old books of mine recently when I was young, and I found a book about ghosts. It was that my mom had purchased for me at a children's museum. So that was kind of a fun find for me. I remember reading that book, and it had all kinds of different stories about ghosts and like ghost legends from around the world and that kind of thing. But I got interested in writing a book about vampires from this incident that happened a few years ago when I was in New York City. I was walking around Times Square with my girlfriend, who's now my fiance, and we came across a Ripley's Believe It or Not auditorium. I'm not sure if you've ever been to one of those.
I have not been to one. I mean, I've heard about it, but I have not been to one. I think it'd be pretty cool, actually.
They're very cool, and I if you have a chance, I highly recommend them. So they're full of different kinds of oddities and strange things and stuff like that. So as we were walking by, I was immediately drawn to it. I said, no, we have to go in here. And I'd been to some in the past as well. So as we're going around and I'm admiring all of the different things, in one area they had this very strange object. It was a vintage box, and it was filled with these different vials and wooden stakes and a pistol and a mold for making silver bullets and stuff like that. And it was labeled as a 19th century vampire killing kit. And I saw that and I was like, well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so I think I probably snapped a picture of it with my phone or something like that. And sometime later when I was back home, my mind kind of wandered back to that kit, and I was like, what's the story with those things? I want to learn a little bit more. And so I wound up, as one does, taking to the internet and doing some Googling. And there's actually a number of vampire killing kits around in different institutions, different Ripley's and other museums and stuff like that. And there's actually some controversy surrounding them, while some maintain, including Ripley's, that they are indeed authentic pieces. Other folks argue that they're actually they've been assembled, probably from vintage parts, but they weren't vampire killing kits back then. It was different pieces someone put together and assembled, in the 20th century at some point. That's the argument against them, and one of the rationales people use is that this thing reflects kind of vampire movies and modern notions about vampires and stuff like that. So that they probably reflect that, and they were built by people who had seen modern things, and so that sort of raised the question for me, sort of a wider question of like, we see vampires in movies and stuff like that, and we kind of all have a sense of what a vampire is. But, having watched a few documentaries about it in the past, I thought, I know there are some differences between what, legends and folklore hold about vampires, what true folkloric beliefs were, and what we think of as vampires now in the modern day, influenced by pop culture. So that's really what the book is about. It's sort of a trait-by-trait analysis of our modern notions about vampires. And so I go through each trait and I try to determine, are there actual folkloric precedents to this? And if there are, I share those stories and legends. And if there aren't, I try to figure out when that trait was introduced into our modern conception about vampires. And so that's really what the book is.
Oh, yeah, that sounds awesome because, I don't think I've ever seen an actual documentary on vampires. It's something that, I am interested in, but I don't think I've ever seen a documentary. So all I know is what I've seen in, movies. So, I mean, is there anything that they put in those movies that have some sort of truth?
Some parts yes, and some parts no. There are some things that are true. Even when they are true, though, I often found that there's certain nuances or things to explore relating to them. So I'll go. Let's say one example here. How do you kill a vampire? Right. Normally, people think stake through the heart. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Wouldn't stake through the heart, and that'll kill the vampire. And that is accurate to folklore. That was absolutely a belief that people would dig up corpses and stake them, believing that they were vampires. And I should probably just make note, nowadays vampires are kind of a fictional pop culture thing in movies, but there was a time when in some places, some areas, vampires were thought to be very real. And people were very scared of them, and they would take actions against corpses to try to destroy these vampires and sort of alleviate these threats, these perceived threats. And we can kind of go into later why they believe those things. But so staking vampires definitely was something that was present in folklore. You hear about it in various accounts, but there's nuance there. So we often think about a stake being like a wooden stake, right? That's often kind of in movies and stuff like that. Well, depending on the place, actually the type of wood was considered important. So some places it would be oak, and oftentimes hawthorn was a wood of choice, or blackthorn. Some of the speculation of why those woods were relevant is because there were beliefs that those woods were used during the crucifixion. Like the crown of thorns. So there was a religious component to the wood that they were using that probably they thought imbued it with something that would give them power over evil. But there's another side to it. There goes from a supernatural side, like I'm talking about here, to actually sort of a pragmatic, practical side. When you read some of the accounts, they talk about pinning the vampire to the ground with a wooden stake. So the notion was that, with some people, that by taking the stake and piercing it through the vampire into the ground underneath it, it would be stuck to the ground and it wouldn't be able to sit up. It wouldn't be able to rise up. So you were physically pinning it to the earth, which is, sort of an interesting take on that. Because we often, in movies, you think of it as more of a magical thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or something like that. And then another piece of that too is that, depending on the place, sometimes it was through the heart, sometimes it was in the stomach or in the head or something like that. It didn't have to be that place depending on the folklore you read. But the notion of putting it through the heart then also gets it into this idea of destroying the heart. And there were some vampire destruction practices that did involve removing the heart and destroying it. So there was a notion there about the heart, probably being an organ associated with life and blood and that kind of thing. By destroying that, you could destroy the vampire. But one of the more fun methods that I kind of got a kick out of, because it's probably something that I would come up with, is rather than digging up the corpse to stake it, what they would do is they would take stakes. They were actually called distaffs. They were used for spinning yarn, but they look like a wooden stake. They would take them, they would drive some into the ground above where the supposed vampire was buried, so that if it tried to rise up, it would stake itself.
Oh.
So that seemed like a very efficient way to handle that. And then you didn't have to dig somebody up, which was probably convenient.
That would be convenient, actually. You just have to make sure you get it in the right spot. Right?
I suppose so. I don't know. Maybe you can put a few around.
Maybe, yeah.
Cover your bases.
That way you know for sure that you got it in the right spot.
Right.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about your book.
Sure. So basically each chapter is devoted to a single trait. So there's a trait about stake through the heart. There's a chapter about garlic. There's a chapter about fangs, that kind of thing. So each chapter is sort of an analysis of that thing. And so then I sort of break down, if there is the folklore, I'll share some stories around it. The book is organized such that the earlier chapters kind of build the later chapters build on the earlier chapters. The earlier chapters kind of start a foundation. So it's kind of an exploration from start to finish. I think I've read some reviews where people have kind of bounced around in it or that kind of thing. But I wrote it kind of with the intent that it sort of creates, it sort of builds upon itself and creates this picture of what the folkloric vampire actually was to people. And so by the time you're done, you have a much clearer image of, well, here's what people actually believed. And there was quite a bit of variation between what people believed. I will say that as well. And what we consider to be a vampire nowadays. And even towards the end of the book, in one of my later chapters, I also talk about the vampire's relationship to witches and werewolves and the overlap between folklore among all these things, because it all sort of influenced each other. We have we like to kind of set things into very specific boxes these days. Well, that's this kind of thing or that kind of thing. But supernatural belief and folklore was much more fluid, and it would sort of change over time, change from place to place, and evolve. It was an evolving kind of thing, because ultimately it was people trying to make sense of the world around them, and to understand things that at that time they did not understand.
That is true. Excuse me. One thing I do want to what about in the movies they always say garlic and things like that. Does that have any truth to it? Absolutely.
Yes, garlic was used as sort of a vampire repellent. It would be hung in homes and entrances. It would be anointed with garlic. Garlic's had significance going back to ancient times, used for different kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So it definitely was used in different places as something to keep the vampires out. There's one of the things I kind of looked into was, well, why was garlic such a thing? And it was believed to repel animals and stuff like that. So right. one can wonder, well, it was, if it repelled these kinds of bad things, well, it could repel other bad things too. But then there's this other sort of hypothesis where, well, garlic is very strong smelling, right? Obviously. Well, vampires were believed to be very strong smelling as well, right? Because they were a decomposing corpse.
Right,
That's probably another difference. That's, you probably wouldn't think of vampires being smelly nowadays, but people back in times past would think that. And so the notion was that the smell of the garlic would overpower the smell of the vampire. And thus, through some kind of like sympathetic magic, it would thus repel the vampire itself. And so that's sort of one hypothesis as to why garlic was used.
Right, yeah. I mean, I always wondered if that was something that was true. They just made it up in movies, and like, how did they even come up with the garlic? But that does make sense that, it does repel, some insects and animals and things like that. But I never thought, it would actually work against a vampire.
Yeah,
but...
yeah, and I mean, in ancient times, it was thought to have health benefit. It was, there was various health benefits associated to it and stuff like that. And so the garlic was written about in an article about Transylvanian superstitions, and Bram Stoker read that article, and he incorporated garlic into the Dracula novel, and thus the Dracula novel set the stage for sort of the evolution of the pop culture vampire.
Very interesting. We do have a question, though. I'm not
sure.
They're asking if you're from Massachusetts.
I am.
Yeah, we had somebody in chat ask that, so just thought I would ask it before I lost it in chat, because our chat is always behind. But okay, so there you go. There's your answer.
There you go.
They grew up with Shay. That's why she was asking.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Let's see. Oh, we do have another question here that just popped in. They want to know which Hollywood movie is the closest to the history of a vampire.
Oh, interesting. Which is like the most authentic?
Uh-huh.
Oh, to actual folklore? Oh, I hadn't really thought of it that way. That's tough to answer. They're all so heavily influenced by Dracula, and Dracula introduced a number of concepts. So it's really hard to it's very hard to separate that out. The influence of Dracula and sort of 19th century literature in general has really impacted it. So I'm not sure which would probably be the most accurate. That's hard to say. That's something I'd have to think about. But there are a lot of good vampire movies out there.
There are. There's a lot of them, but yeah. I mean, since I couldn't answer that either, honestly, since I didn't know about the folklore part of it. I've just seen, movies. I had another question here. Oh, do you want to kind of talk about some of the traits? Like, what are some traits in a vampire? Like, how did they know that these were vampires?
Sure. So I think maybe we'll set the stage a little bit for a kind of vampire scenario. And actually, we mentioned Massachusetts, but New England, wider New England, there actually were cases of supposed vampirism in New England in the 19th century. So that's if I actually talk about some of those cases on my blog. My blog is locationsoflore.com. I'll plug that, I suppose.
Okay, locations
of lore.com. Locationsoflore.com.
Okay.
But yeah, I talk about some of the New England vampire incidents there, and I visit some of the grave sites and that kind of thing. It's very interesting. But so sort of set the stage a little bit. As I mentioned, the belief in vampires was people struggling to sort of make sense of the world around them, right? So imagine that, it's 1700s and you live in sort of a rural village or something like that. And one of the members of the village, maybe a young person seemingly healthy, suddenly gets sick and passes away in a short period of time, right? Mm-hmm. And then suddenly somebody who is close to that person also gets sick afterwards and passes away. And then maybe even another person. And so at this point, you're wondering, what's going on? Something bad is happening to our community, and you're looking for an answer. And you don't know about, you don't know about germ theory and stuff like that. You don't know about, nowadays we think, oh, there's some communicable disease. You need to steer clear of the people who are ill and that kind of thing. But, in those days, they didn't necessarily understand that. So they're looking for the source of this thing. And so they'll, in some of these cases, they go, well, this all started with, those first people who died. Well, let's take a look at the body of that first person who died. Let's see what's going on here. And so they go to the graveyard and they would dig this person up. And so what they would see may surprise them. In the cases of vampires, they would dig up a person who had been dead for a certain amount of time, maybe even a little bit of a while. And they'd look at this person, and this person wouldn't seem like they had decomposed. Their face would be flush, it'd be red. They would look maybe as they did when they were buried. They might actually look fuller. They might look like they've gained weight. It might look that they have new fingernails or something like that. Fresh skin. So they'd see these things and go, well, this is wrong. This person should not look this way. Something's up here. And perhaps one of the most telling things, they would see blood around the mouth at times. Right? So they would see these things. And as I describe these things to you and as listeners hear this, it probably sounds like something's wrong, right? It sounds like a miss. Well, why would this be? This is not what I'm expecting. But in fact, these are natural things that can happen during the decomposition process. While the body, and try not to get too graphic here, but when the body is decomposing, gases can build up within it, and so it will bloat. It looks like it's gained weight. Blood or decompositional fluid can actually come out of the orifices, so there can be what appears to be blood coming out of the mouth, and blood can pool and thus make it look like the face is red or something like that. When layers, like when skin comes off or nails come off, the underneath can look like it's new or fresh, even though it's actually beneath. So they'll see these kinds of things, and to them, that was the indication. Okay, this is a vampire. Someone who's passed away is somehow maintaining their vitality through probably the harm of others. Right, so they're somehow you could conceive of it as they're stealing life from the living to maintain their own sort of undead life, and so that is sort of I'm kind of amalgamating some different accounts here, but that's essentially sort of kind of the prototypical experience there, that they would see a corpse with that was in the process of decomposition, but they wouldn't understand that was a natural thing. It would seem unnatural to them. If they dug up somebody, and this would happen when they would dig up sometimes a few corpses, and they'd look at them, and the ones that were more like skeletal, they had really decomposed. They would go, oh no, that's normal, that's okay, that's not the vampire, that's not what we have to worry about. And so that's kind of what kind of started the folkloric vampire is people trying to make sense of something going on, some kind of disease or something like that. They're looking for an answer. They look towards the dead because there was a fear of the dead, that the dead will make you like them. It will bring you. They will bring you towards them. Right. And so that's what's going on. And so then once you've identified, okay, well, this is the source of the problem. Well, now we can do something here. We can take action against this vampire. And, thus we can, save ourselves. So, there was some kind of, they're, looking for catharsis there, something like that, some kind of, kind of release from what they were experiencing. So that's kind of an experience there.
That is pretty damn interesting. Like how they came up with that, just because. Oh wow, that is. I mean, I could see why they would think that, but.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, I'm often, you can't blame them for this. They didn't have the benefit of the knowledge that we have today, right? They were trying to make sense of the world, and quite frankly, it's better to have them blame the dead than the living, because some of these things I'm describing of like, okay, well, there's something going on where people are sick or crops are there's bad weather or something. Like vampires would also be blamed for some kind of like pestilence or bad weather or something like that. If their sights turn towards the living, well, now you've got witchcraft, you've got a witch, and now you have a living person that they're looking to deal with. Well, with a dead person, you can kind of argue, well, they were already dead anyway. Obviously, it must have been a very sort of traumatic experience for all involved. With the families and stuff like that, having a loved one exhumed. But ultimately, that person had already passed away.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, I could see why they, like I said, I could see why they would think that, but I never would have thought that. Like how they would even come up with, oh, this person's bloating and things like that, and it's a vampire. It's just. It kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, it's surprising, but they saw what they didn't expect to see.
Right.
They were looking to explain it, and there was like, well, there's the blood coming out of the mouth. That's the blood that they stole from the people who are sick and dying. That's what it is. And interestingly, when you read some of the accounts, they often don't mention this. Some of these accounts don't actually mention the sucking of blood until the corpse is exhumed and they see the blood. Sometimes people would complain, oh, the vampire came, this dead person came to me in the night, they strangled me in the night or something like that. But then when they exhume the corpse, they see the blood. Oh, they've been sucking blood. And so it's funny that this decomposition process could actually have be affecting the folklore and affecting our modern notion of, yes, vampires suck blood. And it's like, well, that might actually have been sort of a misinterpretation of what people were seeing, where, this was actually a natural process. And of course, you get into the thing of blood, being associated with life and life essence and stuff like that. So if this undead person is maintaining their life in some fashion and people are losing theirs, well, blood is sort of a mechanism for taking that life. So there's a few different elements at play there that I find intriguing.
Excuse me. Okay, so we have some more questions here before I forget.
Okay.
What is your favorite free public location in New England?
My favorite free public location. Well, I'd say probably one of my favorites. I'll go a little off topic here, but I think it really packs a punch. Is the old Medfield State Hospital? If people are familiar, are you familiar with that?
I'm not, but I think Shay's been there.
I believe she has. She mentioned it.
Yes.
So it was a mental institution or insane asylum, whatever you want to call it, state hospital, and it was abandoned some years ago. But it's sort of a whole complex of buildings, and they're all shuttered, and it's got quite sort of an interesting vibe. It's sort of reminiscent of like a college campus or something like that. It's got roads and everything, and you're sort of walking around among all of these abandoned buildings. And it's just got a certain affect that's quite striking, and it's very nice, especially in the fall. And you can spend some time outside walking around among these old buildings. In the back that they've still got the remainder of some of like the chain link fence that were sort of like, there were areas that I think they would sort of hold patients so that they could go outside, but they weren't free to roam, and so you can like walk through those areas and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's even like a couple I think there was like some signs and stuff around like, oh, that's not the equipment area anymore. It's all abandoned. But so that's a really good place, I think, for a number of reasons. It's fun to walk around there. It's not you can spend some time outside and that kind of thing. So that's a cool one. And I do write about that on my blog. I write you can get some of the history, a little bit of the history of the place and kind of what happened and when it shut down and all that, and a number of pictures I took, so you can kind of see if it's something you want to check out. And I believe it's I think the town treats it kind of like a park. Like during the day, you can walk around it, as far as I know.
Oh wow, cool. if we were closer, we could check it out.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a ways for us because we're in Iowa.
Oh, you're in Iowa?
We're in Iowa.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, I unfortunately I don't know of any places in Iowa that I can recommend.
No, well, but no, I'm saying like in our chat, they're from your area, so that's why they were asking.
Of course, yes, of course,
Yes.
yeah, no. But yeah, but I didn't realize you yourself were in Iowa.
Oh yeah, yep, we're in Iowa. Good old Iowa.
Okay, I don't think I've ever been out there.
You're not missing a whole lot.
Oh no.
There's some good places to investigate, but other than that, it's a lot of corn.
Have you been to New England?
No, never have.
Oh, really?
I know. Somewhere we'd like to go, but it might be a little while down the road before we get anywhere out there. So
Yeah. Well, it's there definitely is. Well, don't come in the middle of winter. I'll say that
No.
much. But there's certainly a lot of history here, a lot of interesting things to see if you like history and that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, Kim and I both really like history, so we would love
Yeah.
it there.
Yeah, in fact, one of my other blog posts, I went to a house that's supposedly haunted that was built, I believe it was built in like the late 1600s. So it's a little old.
A little bit. Dang. Excuse me. All right, so let's see here. We had another question here, and I'll probably butcher this. But have you been to, is it Laconia State School?
I have not.
That was another question that they had in chat to see if
Don't.
you had been there.
No, I have not been there.
All right, and then kind of going back to the vampire things here, kind of skipping all over the place. We had a couple more questions. What are your views on, is it, I don't know if he spelt it right, Vlad the Impaler?
Oh, Vlad the Impaler.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So, Vlad, if you do watch any documentaries about vampires, Vlad is going to come up. He was a prince of Wallachia, which is now part of modern day Romania. So I want to say he reigned in like the 1400s. So he had, he was known as the Impaler. So that kind of gives you a sense of sort of what he was up to. But he was prince. He reigned twice. It was, he was prince, and then he was, kind of deposed, and then he became back again. And he lived in, it was a very brutal time. Where Wallachia was at war with Turkey, and there was the Hungarian Empire right nearby, and so he was he was known for his brutal military tactics, in which he impaled vast numbers of people, put them on pikes and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there was some work, some scholarly work that was done. That identified Bram Stoker's inspiration for Dracula as being Vlad the Impaler. So it was essentially like, okay, so Bram read about Vlad, and he knew about Vlad to a certain extent, and thus Dracula was Vlad, and there's been assertions made that, Vlad dipped his bread into blood and was eating it and stuff like that. So, was Vlad like a vampire and all these kinds of... There's been a lot of overlap between them, and a lot's been kind of made of that. And I do talk about this in my book. But really, the only things that we know is that... Oh, and I should probably also mention... Vlad was not called the Impaler during his time. You wouldn't call him Vlad the Impaler. He was known as Vlad Dracula. His father was initiated into an order of knighthood, the Order of the Dragon, and so he took kind of the sobriquet, so the name Dracul, and then Vlad, being his son, was Dracula, son of the dragon. But Dracul can also mean devil. So there's kind of a some kind of an interesting notion there. But anyway, the thing that we know for certain, and I talk about this in the book, is that Bram Stoker read sort of a quick mention about Dracula in a book. It didn't call him the Impaler or anything like that. He knew that he knew that there was this guy named Dracula. Dracula could mean devil, and he was a prince and fought against Turkey and that kind of thing. So his knowledge of Vlad the Impaler was very, very limited. And in the novel, Van Helsing kind of says, "Oh, this was the person who, fought these wars and stuff like that." So it's clear that Vlad took that and incorporated that, and he actually changed the name of the main character. I think originally Stoker was going to call Dracula like Count Vampire or something like that, and he changed it to Dracula. So great name change.
Yes, I was going to say. The other one doesn't sound too.
Yeah. A lot of punchy name, great name. Yeah. And so there's been notions, people, was Vlad drinking blood, back in the day and stuff like that. And actually, like, that came from a poem, and then it turned out like the poem kind of was mistranslated, and he might have like washed his hands in the blood of his enemies, but he wasn't necessarily consuming blood or anything like that. So I'm of the personal opinion that, there wasn't that much connecting. There was a small connection that Stoker took to influence Dracula to a small extent, name change and a little bit of an origin there. But I don't believe Vlad the Impaler was thought to be a vampire in his time. I don't think Stoker necessarily knew that much about Vlad the Impaler because he doesn't say that much in the novel. And so if Stoker did know more, it would be interesting that he chose to hold that back. But because of this, like, the two are forever linked. Like if you're talking about vampires, Vlad's going to come up. If you're talking about Vlad, you can't sort of ignore the Stoker and thus vampire associations.
That was very interesting. Yeah, and that name, like, why would you? I don't know. Dracula sounds a lot better. Great name.
Great name. But yeah, so that is Count Dracula is named after Vlad Dracula.
All right, I did not know that. I don't think I did, anyways. All right, so let's see here. We do have a couple more questions here. Darren wants to know: was there a lady that was a vampire in the medieval times?
He's they might be referring to the Blood Countess Elizabeth Bathory.
Okay.
That's another kind of historical character that comes up in these kinds of discussions. And she was accused of killing a large number of her servants, and I think the assertion was that she was like bathing in their blood to preserve her youth. And she was found guilty, and I believe she was her punishment that she was walled into a room, into one of the rooms of her castle. So like she wasn't like, I think they like put she wasn't allowed to leave the room. I think they kind of had a physical barrier there, and I think they'd feed her and stuff. But yeah, so it was quite. Apparently, she did that for a long time with servants, girls, and stuff like that. But then eventually, she killed a few too many people apparently. And so there was it was like a trial, and it was a big thing. So that sort of and I think there's some people that wonder about the numbers and stuff like that, and kind of how, what part was sensationalized and what part wasn't. But she often comes up with these because of the whole the blood association, I'd say in particular, that it comes up. But I mean, she was a real person, not necessarily a vampire or anything like that.
Well, there you go. That that was their question. Because they were talking about that. He was asking, and then he said, I thought she bathed in blood. So that'll clear it up for him.
There you go.
Darren. And then he also wanted to know, do silver crosses really work?
Oh, so that's a very interesting one. So I talk about silver in my book, and I talk about crosses in the book. So crosses in and of themselves in folklore do work. There are stories. There's just one interesting story of this guy who he picks up a hitchhiker by a cemetery, and it turns out to be a vampire.
Oh gosh.
So anyway, so the vampire's like, "Go, take me into town," and the vampire he like goes up to they approach some of the houses, and the vampire's like, "Oh, the door's shut tight. I can't go in." And the door wasn't locked, but it had a cross on it. Mm-hmm. And then they come up to a door that, a gate that's all locked up, like with a large lock and all that, but there's no cross, and the vampire just like magically makes it open. Crosses and religious items absolutely feature in folklore as a deterrent to vampires. Silver is something I actually talk about. Silver also in the context of silver bullets, but there is some limited evidence in folklore that silver was used in certain ways as sort of a weapon against vampires, and I kind of explore some of the different examples of silver and some of the evidence I found for that. Not necessarily not highly present in folklore, not very popular necessarily. Of course, one wonders if how many villagers had silver around, right. But it is there. There definitely are a few examples of silver being used, and silver actually was used for all. It actually was effective believed to be effective against werewolves and other kinds of monsters, and witches as well. And of course, when I say witches, I mean like the malevolent like folkloric witches. Mm-hmm. There was actually I'll share a witch story since this is kind of silver is a fun one. I think it was like a doctor who was he was going on like a hunting trip, and out in the woods, and one night this like I think it was like a cat that comes into his the place he was staying, like his cabin or whatever, and none of the dogs react, and the cat starts it stops, it looks at him, and it starts growing large, it starts expanding its size, and so he takes a silver button that he had on his waistcoat, puts it into his pistol, and fires, and hits the cat, and like the cat runs off. I hope I'm remembering all the details of this story, but it's kind of a fun one. But then the next day he's out, and one of the local people comes up to him and says, "Hey, somebody's wife is very sick. You're a doctor. Can you take a look?" And he goes to examine her, and embedded in her chest is his button.
Oh my gosh!
So she was the witch. So it's a very kind of a fun legend there.
Oh wow! Oh, that is pretty good. Excuse me. Okay. Let's see. We have a couple more questions here coming in from chat. Okay. So where did the folklore about you have to invite a vampire in come from?
So I devote a chapter to this. This is an interesting one. This one certainly has the ring of authenticity to it in terms of folklore, right? Because it seems like a weird rule. It doesn't seem like something Hollywood would come up with, right? Because it's so peculiar. So I will say that by and large, in vampire folklore, there is no invitation requirement. Vampires are kind of they're attacking people at will. And that makes sense, right? If people are getting sick and dying, or there's some kind of pestilence or something like that, no one's inviting this dead person in. They're entering. there are a few pieces of folklore that kind of move in the direction of invitation. Like for example, there was in some places there was a belief where the vampire would come to your door and call out for you, and if you answered them, then you would die, or the vampire would do something to you. But the vampire, depending on the place, the vampire would either only ever call once or call twice. So you'd have to wait for the person at your door to call, depending on the place, either the second or the third time. Then you knew it was safe to answer. So like that kind of notion sort of brings you in the direction, but they weren't asking for invitation. It was more of an acknowledgement that you were there. There was one sort of legend I ran across where it was believed that the vampire couldn't enter a house that, I believe they used the terms like clean and holy. They couldn't enter those kinds of houses. So there's this tale of this woman's lover who passes away unbeknownst to her, and then comes back to her and is like, "No, come outside, come see me," because he couldn't go in. But he wasn't looking for an invitation. He couldn't enter regardless. So there's a few different things that kind of bring you in the direction of invitations, but really the invitation was a product of 19th century literature. There's one story in particular that kind of maybe hints at it or might imply it, but where it's really set down hard and firm is in Dracula. And Stoker includes that detail. So, but yeah, so I explore this in one of the chapters of my book, and you can obviously find out like a little bit more about some of that there with some info about the legends and stuff. But that's a very interesting one because it seems like it would be true, because why would you introduce something that makes it harder to write a story, right? Like it's it seems sort of injected. But I find that's one I find sort of interesting, because it was a bit of sort of an evolution towards getting it.
Excuse me, my allergies are still acting up. All right, couple more here. We had lost my spot. All right, does a modern day vampire exist yet?
Oh.
In your
Well,
opinion?
well, I suppose it all depends on what you mean by vampires. But I mean, obviously there are people out there who sort of dressed in kind of a gothic kind of Victorian vampire garb, and there are people who believe that they need blood or need energy or that kind of thing, or like real life vampires. That is not something that I've really spent time researching. That's not kind of my research focus. So I can't really comment on a lot of that, because I haven't looked it up too much. I feel like nowadays, if I kind of sort of think about the notion of vampires, even in pop culture, there's much more of a scientific slant in a lot of shows for vampires, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you think of like a classic vampire, like 1800s vampire, it's it's evil, it's mythical, it's magical, right? It's supernatural. And I think some vampire things now, vampire fiction and vampire shows, they like to go towards the scientific explanation of it was some kind of mutation or something like that. And so I do wonder what will happen with our sort of modern fictional vampires and our modern notions of vampires, and how that will evolve to have more of a scientific basis in TV and movies and stuff like that, and there will be less emphasis on the supernatural and the religious aspects of it.
Very good. Okay, let's see. Another question here. It's about a movie. Did Interview with a Vampire get it wrong? Is another question in there.
It's been a long time since I've seen that movie.
Yeah, same.
I think I remember it being a good movie. It's very much based on our pop culture notions of vampires. So it is that and that's okay. The vampire has evolved over time to meet the needs of society, right? In the 1700s and earlier, it was meeting a need of explaining things that people couldn't explain, a rationale for diseases or pestilence. And nowadays it's a form, the vampires, it's entertainment and it's exciting and stuff like that. So the vampires in those kinds of movies, there's a romantic element to it, right? They're alluring. That's luring vampires, very much again a product of the literature of the 1800s. That's when those notions were introduced. But the other thing about vampires, like in Interview the Vampire, is that they're immortal, right? That they don't die, they live on forever. And I feel like there's a lot of focus on that in our modern day shows and stuff. Back some hundreds of years ago, people weren't getting all excited at the notion of, oh, these vampires, they live forever. Wow, I wonder what that would be like and all this, right? That wasn't on the radar screen that much. They were more worried like, oh, this thing's going to come and kill us all. But nowadays, and again, it's this evolution of the vampire and the vampire meeting the needs. We've explained away a lot of the diseases and disasters that people didn't understand. Right now, we understand that there's when people are getting sick, there are diseases and things like that. We have cures for a lot of things. If we don't have a cure, we still can understand. Mm-hmm. But sort of the one thing that there's many things that science hasn't conquered. But one of the big things that science hasn't conquered is, mortality, right? So there's kind of a focus on our own mortality and aging, right? So the notion of something that can stay young and live forever is appealing to us. It's speaking to us, right, on kind of a fundamental level, a fear of our own mortality. No longer a fear of the dead in the cemetery, but of a fear of our own aging process. And so that's why I think the vampire kind of resonates with us, and it fits into an alluring thing now, right? Because that's alluring, that allures people of, to be young forever. But at the same time, right, that comes at a cost. So now they're kind of cursed in a way, and they have to live a certain way and harm others to survive. And so I often wonder if there's this kind of poetic aspect to it. Well, perhaps that's the price you pay for subverting nature, right? The natural course has now been changed, and thus there's a penalty that you have to be incurred. So again, the vampire, it's an adaptive thing. It speaks to us on various levels and at various times.
Mm-hmm. Sorry. Oh goodness.
Bless you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it is the season for that, so.
It is indeed.
So we have one in here, and I'm going to butcher this, and I know that they're probably putting in this in here, so I will butcher it.
Uh-oh.
Okay, here we go. Maybe I should just spell it out. Let's see here. Is it Nosferatu?
Oh, Nosferatu.
Yes, versus
Yep.
Bram Stokes. Which one is better?
So Nosferatu, it was so that's a black and white silent German film, impressionist film from the 1920s. If you haven't seen it, you probably have seen like the image of the vampire from it. Mm-hmm. So the vampire in this movie is very, very striking, played by an actor, I believe, named Max Schreck. The vampire's name is Count Orlok. He's bald with like these pointy ears and a pale face and these two fangs that are more like his two front teeth. They're like rat-like fangs, and he's got elongated kind of fingernails, and he's all dressed in black. So even if you haven't seen the film, you probably have seen an image inspired by him or of him in like maybe Halloween decorations or something with that kind of theming, kind of Halloween theming or something like that. So you talk about sort of Nosferatu versus versus like Bram Stoker's Dracula, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So Nosferatu. So the interesting story about Nosferatu is that movie that was the production company Prana Films that wanted to make this vampire movie. They wanted to do a Dracula film. They wanted to do a movie version of Dracula, right? Because this is the 1920s. Dracula came out in the late 1890s. They didn't have the rights to the Dracula novel, but they decided that, well, let's change some of the details, and that will get us around copyright infringement, and then we can make our movie. So that's what they did. So they changed they changed like the main character names, right? So that's why it's Count Orlok and not Count Dracula. And they changed like, you know, Jonathan Harker, he's like the main character, and they changed his name and his fiance and all that. So and they changed some of the plot elements and stuff, but you know, not enough. And so they released this film, and Stoker's widow sues. She sues for copyright infringement, and Prana loses the case, and the judge rules that all copies of the film are to be destroyed. And thankfully for us, some of the copies, or at least one copy, made it through that purge, and we still have the film today. And so it's a great film. Obviously, it's silent, and you know, it's black and white and all that. You know, it's a product of its time. But it's incredibly atmospheric. The vampire design is quite compelling and has lasted because we still sort of see it. We see it, you know, still around today. And I talk about Nosferatu in I think a couple points in my book, because it actually was relevant to some of the vampire traits. But you know, if you have a chance to see it, it's pretty good. If you're a fan of vampires, it's quite interesting. And so it's funny because it's essentially kind of an adaptation of Stoker's thing, not licensed, but I kind of find it sort of an interesting story. So I would, and it's got a very important place, I'd say, in sort of the evolution and history of vampires, you know, just in general, what I'm talking about specifically in terms of film and that kind of thing.
All right, so there we go. I'll have to check it out. I probably have seen it, but I just don't remember. I mean, I watched a lot of that kind of stuff with my parents growing up, but I just don't remember.
You've probably at least seen like a clip of it or something like that.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
it's
very good.
All right, so one question here that's running in pretty much every show is, what is the one object in the world you would never want to be haunted?
One object in the world. Oh, I don't know. That's it. I mean, you can take that in a lot of different directions, I suppose, right?
Oh yeah, anything goes. Anything goes.
Wouldn't want it to be haunted, and it should be a singular. I mean, obviously, like you don't want your house to be haunted, right?
Right.
So there's one. I suppose you wouldn't want your house to be haunted, at least by a malevolent spirit, right?
Right. Yeah.
Something like that. It'd probably be rough if your cell phone was haunted.
Oh, yeah.
Because then, like, you wouldn't be getting your messages, or it might be sending emails on your behalf or something like that.
Yeah.
You might get, like, signed up for all kinds of crazy things. So
rack up your bills.
Yeah, exactly. Suddenly you
never
bought
know.
all this stuff on Amazon.
Son. Yeah.
But all like this vintage stuff that the ghost wants in the house.
Yeah. That's a good one. I don't think I had heard that one yet.
No, I don't think I've.
At least not on our show, I haven't. Maybe on some of the others, but I have not heard that one yet. So that's a good answer. Good answer. Okay, before we start wrapping up things, why don't you let us know where they can find your book, and if they want to find out more about you and your blog, where can they go?
Sure. So first of all, the book, it's called Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions by me, AP Sylvia. It was released by Schiffer Publishing. You can find it on various internet sites, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Target.com, and various others. I believe some Barnes & Noble locations like in the New York and LA area actually have it in stock. I'm not sure about others, but you can always, you can check with your local bookstore if they have it. And if they don't, you can always ask them to get it for you as well. If you want to learn more about what I'm up to, my website is locationsoflore.com. And on there, I post about some of the different places I've been to with pictures and if there's interesting legends about it or if it's just kind of a spooky place or something. I have links to my social media on there, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So you can keep tabs on me there as well.
Okay, perfect. And I'll post this stuff. We'll post it on our social media as well. So that way, if you're not writing it down, we will have that information available to you as well.
And Shay will probably post it later, too.
And I'm sure Shay will post it as well. Hope she's feeling better. So I just want to give quick shout-outs to everybody who was in chat tonight. We had Christopher, we had Nico, we had Darren, we had Lewis, we had Matt, we had myself. Shay did pop in for a brief, just to make sure I probably wasn't screwing up her show too much. I got this. I figured it out. We had Christopher, we had Eye of the Beholder in there, we had myself, and we had Kim. So thank you, everybody who was in chat tonight. Thank you for everybody who was not in chat but listening. We appreciate each and every one of you. Next week, I'm sure Shay will be feeling better and be back to the show.
So she gets better fast.
Yes, we hope for a speedy recovery for her. We thank our special guest tonight, AP Sylvia, for letting us know all about vampires. And like I said, we will post his information for you so that way you can check him out. Have a good night, everybody.